Winter night 1944. The industrial heart of the Ruhr lay beneath a heavy ceiling of clouds, its furnaces dimmed, its factories reduced to jagged silhouettes after months of relentless bombing. On the frozen ground, the remnants of Germany's flak units struggled to repair their exhausted radar stations, scavenging spare parts from wrecked batteries. They sensed a threat approaching but had no grasp of its scale. High above them, so high they could not yet hear the engines, a massive formation from the U.S. 8th Air Force crossed the Dutch border in perfect geometric order. More than 1,200 bombers moved as one, a steel armada stretching across the sky. Veteran Luftwaffe observers would later call it a horizon of wings. The first low tremor reached the earth like a distant storm. Sergeant Ernst Keller, a 19-year-old flak operator, wrote in his diary, "I heard them before I saw them, and in that moment I understood that tonight would mark the beginning of our end." As the sound grew into a deafening roar, the young men along the gun lines realized the truth. Nothing they had left could stop what was descending toward them, and the night was about to ignite. In early 1944, Western Germany had become a landscape shaped by exhaustion and relentless attrition. The Ruhr, long considered the beating industrial heart of the Third Reich, was now a region strained under shortages of coal, machinery failures, and the constant threat of Allied air raids that arrived with mechanical regularity. Since 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force and Britain's Bomber Command had shifted their strategic priorities, cripple Germany's armament production, dismantle its transportation network, and break the morale of its workforce. Each week brought new formations, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators streaming over the North Sea and the Netherlands in daylight assaults that pushed German air defenses to the brink. By the final weeks of the year, German commanders acknowledged privately that they were fighting an air war for which they no longer had the fuel, pilots, or radar capacity to sustain. The Luftwaffe's fighter wings, once feared across Europe, were crippled by chronic fuel shortages after the loss of Romanian oil fields, forcing many pilots to conserve kerosene even during training. Replacement aircraft sat unusable on airfields because the pilots expected to fly them had barely 5 or 6 hours of flight time. These crews faced an enemy that now flew with numerical superiority so overwhelming that American bomber groups sometimes advanced in formations larger than entire Luftwaffe fighter divisions. The terrain of the Ruhr, dense clusters of factories, narrow rivers, and rail hubs, was once considered so vital that Hitler referred to it as the Empire's iron lungs. But the same geography worked against the defenders. Radar stations had to be squeezed into limited elevated areas, making them predictable targets, and anti-aircraft batteries were scattered across industrial zones already strained by power outages. Winter weather made everything harder. Fog clung to river valleys, icing crippled equipment, and bitter winds said flak crews to rotate every 30 minutes to avoid frostbite. Germany's sophisticated early warning network, the Kammhuber line, had been severely degraded by Allied countermeasures like window, strips of aluminum foil dropped by bombers that created false signals on radar screens. By late 1944, many radar operators admitted they no longer trusted the readings. A young technician named Willy Hartmann wrote in a private letter, "We are blind half the time. We wait for a signal that may be false, then scramble men and batteries based on hope rather than certainty." Experts from the Luftwaffe High Command attempted to restore order by sending mobile radar trucks across the region, but fuel scarcity meant they often remained parked indefinitely. Meanwhile, American analysts studying captured German communications noticed something striking. The defenders were increasingly reactive rather than predictive. They waited for bomber formations to appear on the horizon before coordinating flak concentrations, a sign that the once formidable German air defense system was unraveling. The Americans, by contrast, entered 1944 with a level of coordination unmatched in the war. Radar-guided navigation, long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, and increasingly precise bombing technology allowed them to hit targets with greater efficiency. Their bases in England operated like vast mechanical organisms, crews loading bombs through the night, intelligence officers marking weather routes, maintenance teams swapping engines in freezing rain. When the 8th Air Force decided to launch a major strike against the Ruhr, Everything moved with industrial precision. Briefings at dawn, assembly of aircraft over designated airfields, and a long climb toward cruising altitude before crossing the North Sea. Inside Germany, civilian morale teetered. Workers trudged into factories despite frequent blackouts and shortages, knowing each day carried the possibility of catastrophe. The thudding approach of bomber formations sent thousands rushing to shelters, where the heat of explosions above ground radiated through concrete walls. A factory foreman in Essen later recalled, "You did not need to see the aircraft. The air changed first, pressure, temperature, then the sound. It was like the sky itself turning solid." Reports from German military archives show that even senior officers understood the mathematical reality overtaking them. They were outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outnumbered. The upcoming raid, one they suspected but could not fully detect, was not just another bombardment. It was part of a systematic strategy to finish crushing Germany's industrial capability in the West. And as the night of the coming raid approached, the defenders felt the tightness of inevitability settling in. Their weapons were still capable, their resolve remained, but their margins of survival shrank by the hour, and deep within their ranks, a quiet dread began to spread, an understanding that the next wave from the sky might be the one that Germany could no longer withstand, pushing the war closer to a turning point from which there would be no recovery, and leading naturally into a deeper analysis of the strategic pressures shaping both sides. As the strategic situation deepened in late 1944, Germany's internal structure strained under pressures that few within the high command were willing to admit publicly. Politically, the regime was locked in a paradox, insisting the Reich remained unbreakable, while privately circulating reports confirming the steady collapse of its industrial arteries. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, warned repeatedly that the loss of synthetic fuel plants, targets the Americans prioritized, would cripple Germany's capacity to deploy aircraft or armor. His warnings, however, collided with Hitler's insistence that production could recover if only the population showed unwavering faith. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground painted a different picture. Transportation networks were failing as Allied bombers repeatedly targeted key rail junctions, leaving trains stranded and factories unable to move raw materials. Coal deliveries fell sharply, causing rolling blackouts that halted assembly lines for hours or days. Inside the Ruhr, managers shifted workers to night shifts in hopes of minimizing the impact of daytime raids, but this only increased exhaustion among laborers already weakened by rationing and limited heat during winter nights. Germany's once vaunted command structure showed widening fractures as well. Field Marshal Göring, theoretically responsible for the Luftwaffe, struggled to present a coherent air defense plan. He demanded heroics from depleted fighter groups while refusing to confront the mathematical certainty that his pilots were dying faster than he could replace them. Many commanders bypassed Göring's directions, working instead with regional air defense officers who improvised local strategies using whatever resources remained. These strategies often included deceptive lighting systems, attempts to lure bombers off course, or consolidating flak batteries around high-value industrial complexes. Yet, such improvisations could not compensate for systemic collapse. Luftwaffe logistics officers repeatedly noted that without stable fuel supplies, even functional aircraft were irrelevant. One internal memo, later recovered by Allied intelligence, read simply, "We are producing machines we cannot fly." On the American side, strategic planning matured into a deeply coordinated structure that blended intelligence, technological advantage, and overwhelming industrial capacity. Analysts compiled data from radar sweeps, decoded German transmissions, reconnaissance flights, and captured documents. They mapped patterns of air defense behavior, calculated the likelihood of radar blindness under certain atmospheric conditions, and planned bomber routes to exploit German weaknesses. By late 1944, American planners had identified that nighttime cloud cover combined with winter winds created gaps in German early warning. They also discovered that the Germans frequently repositioned their heavy flak batteries around Essen and Dortmund, creating brief windows where outer industrial zones were inadequately defended. This intelligence shaped the design of the upcoming raid. The 8th Air Force intended to strike with precision, hit synthetic fuel facilities, steelworks, and transportation choke points in one synchronized assault. Furthermore, long-range P-51 escorts were tasked to sweep ahead, hunting German fighters before they could form defensive groups. These tactics reflected a radical shift from earlier in the war. The Americans no longer accepted heavy losses from flak and fighters. They aimed for air supremacy so complete that German resistance would break not just physically but psychologically. Inside Germany, the psychological toll was already evident. Civilians endured sleepless nights in crowded bunkers, emerging at dawn to streets coated with shattered brick and glass. Factories filled with dust from collapsed machinery. Some workplaces operated with only partial roofing. Rumors circulated that American aircraft now flew with impunity, that their formations stretched for kilometers, and that no amount of flak could dent them. A young machinist named Hans Müller wrote in his diary, "We keep working because we must, but the sky is no longer ours. It belongs to the enemy." Even among military personnel, morale wavered. Flak crews discussed stories of entire batteries wiped out by a single high-altitude strike. Radar operators whispered that their screens were becoming useless, cluttered with false echoes. And fighter pilots, those few with enough fuel to fly, often scrambled knowing they would be outnumbered 10 to 1. The internal contradictions of the Reich grew sharper each week. A leadership demanding victory, while its soldiers and civilians confronted a reality shaped by scarcity, exhaustion, and an enemy that grew stronger. The American position, by contrast, reflected clarity of purpose and the momentum of an industrial titan hitting its stride. Every bomber that left England did so with carefully plotted routes, precise timing, and a support network of thousands ensuring it reached its target. The next phase of the air campaign was not just another mission, it was the culmination of months of strategic refinement, intelligence breakthroughs, and industrial power marshaled toward a singular objective: crush the Ruhr's ability to sustain the German war machine. And as dawn approached on the day of the planned attack, the stage was set for decisions and reactions that would reveal the human and tactical dimensions of the conflict, naturally guiding the narrative toward the more intimate perspectives shaping the coming events. From the ground, the approaching American raid unfolded not as a strategic diagram, but as a human experience defined by fear, duty, and the vast machinery of war pressing down on individuals who could neither see nor control the full picture. For the young German soldiers stationed in the Ruhr's flak belts, the sky had become a place of dread long before the night of the major assault. 19-year-old Sergeant Ernst Keller, whose diary survived the war, described the moment he first sensed the coming wave as a vibration in the air, like the earth bracing for something it couldn't refuse. His battery commander shouted orders through numb lips, hands trembling from cold and tension alike, while the men struggled to keep their feet steady on frozen steel platforms. They were exhausted, many operating on little sleep after constant night alerts, yet they carried a grim determination. Keller later recalled that the worst part was not the blast of bombs, but the anticipation. The long minutes when their guns were loaded, their ears pricked for the roar descending from above, each man silently hoping that the target would somehow shift away from them. For Luftwaffe officers overseeing the region, the perspective was one of mounting desperation. Intelligence reports showed that radar interference was worsening, fuel shortages were crippling fighter readiness, and flak ammunition stocks were being rationed. Lieutenant Colonel Rudolf Stein, assigned to coordinate sector defenses, kept a log in which he wrote, "We are arranging defenses like a man trying to hold back a tide with bare hands." He understood the mathematics behind the American formations, hundreds of bombers protected by swarms of P-51s, and he knew the Luftwaffe no longer possessed the strength or coherence to counter them effectively. Every decision he made carried the weight of acknowledging an ugly truth. Even the most disciplined defensive plan could not compensate for structural collapse. Yet he persisted, driven by a mixture of duty, pride, and an unwillingness to abandon the civilians under his protection. Technology itself offered another perspective, one shaped not by emotion but by the cold logic of machinery. American bomber crews trusted their Norden bomb sites, radio beacons, and radar navigation systems to guide them through cloud banks and hostile airspace. To them, the mission represented a convergence of engineering, training, and statistical planning, each bomber a node in a carefully calculated grid. Inside the belly of the B-17, the bombardier lay prone, gripping the sighting controls with mechanical precision, while navigators calculated headings with the confidence that the sky now favored those who possessed the tools to read it. Meanwhile, German radar technicians crouched beside flickering screens disrupted by Allied countermeasures trying to decipher distorted signals that danced like ghosts. Their equipment, once cutting edge, now sputtered under shortages of spare parts and the overwhelming sophistication of American electronic warfare. The contrast revealed a widening technological gulf that no amount of courage could bridge. A final perspective emerged from the moral and emotional toll borne by civilians trapped beneath the converging forces. In the city of Essen, factory workers descended into bunkers as sirens wailed for the 100th time that winter. For them, the war had ceased to be a distant struggle of armies and become instead a rhythm of shockwaves, collapsing roofs, and the acrid taste of dust. Among them was Greta Vogt, a steelworker's wife who later testified to Allied researchers about the night she realized Germany could no longer hope to resist. The sky glowed red, she said, and the sound came from everywhere at once. It felt as if the world above us had turned to fire. Her account captures the helplessness of ordinary people caught in the machinery of strategic warfare. Individuals who had no influence on national decisions yet bore the full consequence of them. Their fear, layered atop the exhaustion of soldiers and the desperation of officers, completed the human landscape shaping the night of the Great American Strike. And within these overlapping perspectives, tensions continued to rise, setting the stage for deeper fractures and further revelations that would emerge in the next phase of decision-making and leadership struggles. Within the German High Command, leadership tensions had grown into quiet fault lines by the winter of 1944, each decision shaped not only by strategic necessity but by political fear and the erosion of trust between commanders. General Oberst Hans Jeschonek's earlier suicide in 1943 had already revealed the psychological toll of prosecuting an unwinnable air war, and by late 1944 his successors found themselves confronting the same cruel arithmetic. Field commanders pleaded for reinforcements, extra radar stations, and fuel allocations, but their requests were often dismissed or delayed by a bureaucracy more concerned with maintaining ideological loyalty than addressing operational realities. Senior staff officers debated the value of dispersing industry versus concentrating defenses around remaining strongholds, yet the arguments rarely produced actionable solutions. One Luftwaffe general later admitted, "We were arguing about the arrangement of stones in a house that was already on fire." Beneath these debates simmered a quiet dread, the realization that the Reich's industrial and military structure was collapsing faster than orders could be drafted to respond to it. In the realm of tactical analysis, German strategists attempted to revise their approach to confronting Allied air raids. Some advocated for massing remaining fighters into a single decisive interception group, while others emphasized conserving resources for the defense of the homeland's final industrial zones. These arguments unfolded against the backdrop of rapidly shrinking resources. Combat reports from Jagdgeschwader units showed that pilots were flying with such limited fuel that they could engage the incoming bombers for only minutes before being forced to break off. Mechanics salvaged parts from wrecked aircraft to keep others flying, creating a fleet held together by desperation and technical improvisation. Meanwhile, flak commanders proposed relocating some heavy batteries to create overlapping fields of fire, but each relocation required fuel, manpower, and time. Luxuries they no longer possessed. A persistent fear loomed over every tactical discussion that the Americans would soon deploy a raid so large, so coordinated, and so destructive that no amount of tactical ingenuity could meaningfully blunt its impact. Beyond strategy and leadership, the social impact of the air war deepened the fractures within German society. Civilian morale had begun to shift from resilience to resignation. Families who had once believed in the propaganda of inevitable victory now spoke quietly in shelters about rumors of Allied advances, dwindling resources, and the steady retreat of German forces on every front. Teachers wrote in private letters about classrooms where children flinched at distant engine noise, and shopkeepers recorded in their diaries diaries how customers hoarded candles and bread in anticipation of longer blackouts. In some cities, local councils attempted to maintain public order by distributing pamphlets promising that new miracle weapons would change the course of the war. But these assurances rang increasingly hollow to a population that watched the sky burn week after week. The social strain extended to forced laborers working in factories across the Ruhr, many of whom faced brutal conditions while knowing Allied bombers could destroy their workplaces at any moment. These layers of fear, exhaustion, and disillusionment created a psychological landscape just as fragile as the military situation. Amid these pressures, the final perspective emerged from the convergence of all the others, a growing awareness within both German and American command structures that the conflict was entering a decisive stage. American intelligence analysts reviewing reconnaissance photos and intercepted communications recognized that German defenses were degrading at a rate that opened the door for a large-scale, decisive blow. Meanwhile, German officers sensed that each passing week brought the enemy closer to overwhelming superiority. In this atmosphere, the weight of impending confrontation settled like a storm front over the Ruhr. Soldiers braced themselves with the grim acceptance of men who understood that their role was no longer to repel the enemy, but to delay catastrophe. Civilians carried on with daily tasks, haunted by the knowledge that the next major raid might be the one that shattered what little remained of their world. And American bomber crews prepared for missions with a confidence tempered by the sobering reality that they were part of a strategy designed to break an entire nation's industrial backbone. All these perspectives intertwined, shaping a moment in history when decisions, hopes, fears, and machines aligned toward a confrontation that neither side could avoid, and together they propelled the narrative toward the imminent turning point that would define the coming climax of the air war. The turning point arrived on a frigid morning in late 1944 when the U.S. 8th Air Force launched one of the most meticulously coordinated raids of the entire European air campaign. Before dawn, bomber crews filed into briefing rooms scattered across bases in eastern England, rubbing their hands for warmth as maps were uncovered to reveal a route arcing over the North Sea toward the Ruhr. Intelligence officers pointed to red-circled targets, synthetic fuel plants, steelworks, transportation hubs, and power stations, each one a vital artery feeding the German war machine. The plan called for more than 1,200 bombers, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, to converge on the industrial basin in a single synchronized blow. It was an operation designed not only to inflict physical destruction, but to collapse what remained of Germany's ability to wage war through air and metal. As the sun lifted over frostbitten runways, engines roared to life by the hundreds, and for a moment the entire landscape of East Anglia vibrated like a single immense machine awakening for battle. At altitude, the bomber stream formed with breathtaking precision. Dozens of combat wings merged into a formation so vast that pilots described it as a moving highway in the sky. Radio chatter remained minimal, navigation executed through established timing and disciplined flying that allowed the armada to function as if guided by a single will. Over the Netherlands, civilian witnesses looked up to see the sunlight glinting off hundreds of silver fuselages, a sight so immense that some believed it signaled the final stage of the war. On the German side, the first radar signals appeared as faint, irregular flickers, distorted by Allied jamming and the atmospheric interference of a winter front moving in from the west. For several minutes, German operators struggled to interpret the chaotic display until the pattern suddenly stabilized, revealing a bomber formation of unprecedented scale, pushing directly toward the Ruhr. Alarm circuits triggered across the region and flak crews scrambled into position, boots pounding across icy pavements as officers shouted target bearings into the frigid air. Inside the Ruhr, the tension broke like a snapped cable. Sirens wailed across Essen, Bochum, and Dortmund as civilians rushed into shelters, clutching children, blankets, and small bags packed long ago for nights just like this. Factory lines ground to a halt as workers abandoned machinery mid-operation. In the command centers, Luftwaffe officers barked orders into telephones, demanding immediate deployment of fighter units, even though many of those units were grounded with empty fuel tanks. A handful of fighters managed to climb into the cold, thin air, their engines sputtering as pilots tried to conserve every drop of precious aviation fuel. They ascended into a sky already vibrating with the approach of American engines, knowing they were flying into an unequal battle. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Franz Behrens, later described the moment he saw the bomber stream as a silver storm that covered the horizon. He and his wingmen dove toward the formation, only to be intercepted almost immediately by P-51 Mustangs sweeping ahead of the bombers like a shield. The brief dogfight that followed was desperate and chaotic, the German pilots fighting with exceptional skill but fatally limited by numbers and fuel. Behrens' testimony captures the helplessness of that moment. We were not fighting to win, we were fighting because we could not do otherwise. Below, the flak batteries opened fire. Dozens of heavy 88mm guns thundered across the valley, sending black puffs of shrapnel into the sky. The air filled with the metallic scent of cordite, and the ground shook under the recoil of the guns. Yet the sheer altitude and density of the bomber formation blunted the effectiveness of the flak. Shells burst too low or too scattered to break the American formation apart. Inside a B-17 flying fortress named Lucky Miriam, the bombardier peered through the Norden bomb site, waiting for the green light that indicated alignment with the target. The aircraft vibrated under the pressure wave of nearby flak bursts, but the crew held their discipline, each man locked into the routine that separated professionalism from fear. When the signal finally came, bomb bay doors opened in unison across the fleet, releasing thousands of pounds of explosives that glittered for a moment in the sunlight before plunging downward. The bombs struck with devastating precision. Fireballs erupted across industrial blocks, sending smoke columns spiraling into the sky. Synthetic fuel tanks detonated with thunderous shock waves that rolled through the valley, breaking windows miles away. Machinery halls collapsed in showers of sparks and twisted steel. Rail lines buckled under the force of the blasts, severing critical transport arteries. Civilians huddled underground felt the earth convulse as explosives hammered the surface, each impact punctuated by the distant, mournful groan of collapsing buildings. In Luftwaffe headquarters, officers stared at status reports arriving too quickly to process, each one confirming a worsening disaster. Radios crackled with partial transmissions from flak units overwhelmed by smoke, structural collapse, and equipment failure. As the bomber formation banked away from the burning industrial zone and began its journey back toward England, the scale of the strike became brutally clear. The Ruhr, already battered, now lay beneath a mantle of smoke that stretched for kilometers. German officers surveying the horizon from command posts understood that something irreversible had happened. This was no longer a war of attrition or positional advantage. It was the moment when air power demonstrated its capacity to break the backbone of a nation's industrial war effort, a realization that would cascade into immediate tactical and human consequences that unfolded in the hours that followed. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing run, the Ruhr Valley lay beneath a churning canopy of smoke so dense that pilots from the trailing bomber groups reported they could smell burning fuel and scorched metal even at altitude. As the American formation turned westward, the last wave of bombers released delayed fuse munitions designed to penetrate deep into steelworks, power stations, and rail yards before detonating. The resulting secondary explosions rippled through the industrial basin, igniting chemical stores, rupturing pipelines, and transforming entire factory blocks into infernos visible from more than 30 kilometers away. On the ground, German rescue crews emerged hesitantly from their shelters, blinking against swirling ash as they attempted to make sense of the devastation. Streets were clogged with debris from collapsed facades, and entire neighborhoods were blanketed in dust that fell like thick gray snow. Fire brigades, already stretched thin, rushed from one blaze to another, their hoses sputtering as water pressure failed across sections of the city where pipelines had been shattered by the blasts. Men shouted through smoke-choked streets, calling out names of missing colleagues, while others dug through rubble with bare hands searching for survivors. Inside the command post, the atmosphere shifted from frantic activity to grim resignation. Reports trickled in, first from flak batteries that had run out of ammunition, then from radar stations whose antennas had been torn apart by blast waves, and finally from civil defense units overwhelmed by fires they could not contain. A communication officer in Essen later recalled that every message read like a piece of a larger catastrophe, each line confirming what the leadership already feared. The American raid had inflicted damage beyond anything previously sustained. Synthetic fuel production was halted entirely in several sites, power grids were knocked offline, and the rail network, the arteries that fed Germany's factories, lay severed in multiple directions. Senior Luftwaffe officers listening to these reports recognized the strategic implications immediately. Without fuel, their fighter wings could not fly. Without electricity, their armament factories could not function. With crippled rail lines, even the movement of coal and steel became nearly impossible. The bombing had not merely damaged the Ruhr. It had broken the structural logic that allowed the region to sustain Germany's war effort. Amid the physical destruction, shock spread through the ranks of the defenders. Flak crews, who had endured hours of relentless bombardment, stared at their shattered equipment, scarcely believing the scale of the attack they had just faced. A veteran gunner, interviewed years later, said, "It was as if the sky itself had declared we could not win." Fighter pilots returning from desperate engagements landed on runways littered with debris, their aircraft low on fuel and ammunition, some too damaged to fly again. Pilots who had once taken pride in Luftwaffe prowess now moved wordlessly across airfields, shoulders slumped, knowing that their attempts to penetrate the bomber screen had failed almost entirely. Their frustration mixed with a deeper awareness. The battle for control of the sky was effectively over. For civilians, the raid marked a psychological rupture. Those emerging from bunkers confronted a transformed landscape. Smoldering ruins where factories had stood, rails twisted like threads, entire blocks reduced to skeletal frames. Families walked in stunned silence past buildings that had defined their lives for decades, now unrecognizable in the soot and firelight. Mothers clutched children who covered their ears, even though the bombers were gone, the phantom echoes of explosions still rattling their nerves. Shopkeepers stared at collapsed storefronts. Factory foremen saw years of labor ground into rubble. In diaries and testimonies, many residents described the same realization, that the war, once spoken of with confidence, was now closing in on them with an unavoidable finality. America's ability to strike with such overwhelming force had become undeniable, and the idea that Germany could still produce, repair, or resist at scale seemed increasingly impossible. Even within the American ranks, there was a moment of somber reflection as the returning air crews crossed the North Sea. Though buoyed by the success of the operation, they understood that their bombs had fallen upon factories staffed by exhausted workers, many of whom had no control over the war's direction. Pilots exchanged tired glances during debriefings, acknowledging both the effectiveness of the mission and the human weight it carried. Intelligence officers collected strike footage and bomb site photographs confirming that key targets were obliterated. Technicians laid out maps that now bore fresh marks of destruction, each symbol representing another link severed in Germany's industrial chain. By nightfall, the Ruhr remained engulfed in fires that burned uncontrollably, casting a red glow across the horizon. The silence that settled between explosions felt heavier than the noise that preceded it. German officials surveying the damage understood with chilling clarity that the events of the day represented a decisive shift in the war. They no longer asked if further raids would come. They asked how soon and whether anything remained that could be defended. The magnitude of the losses, the vulnerability of their defenses, and the crushing weight of industrial paralysis converged into a stark truth. Germany had just endured a blow from which recovery might be impossible. And as exhausted soldiers, civilians, and commanders confronted this reality, the narrative moved inexorably toward the broader consequences that would soon unfold, setting the stage for the aftermath to reveal the irreversible cost of that day. In the hours that followed the American strike, the Ruhr Valley resembled a hollowed shell of its former industrial might. Its landscape transformed into a tapestry of smoldering ruins, fractured rail lines, and silent factories that had once supplied the German war machine with critical lifeblood. Initial assessments from civil defense units painted a bleak picture. Synthetic fuel facilities were not merely damaged but incapacitated. Steelworks that had sustained the Wehrmacht's armor divisions lay buried under mangled beams and collapsed roofs. and power stations, their turbines shattered by direct hits, ceased to generate the electricity that once pulsed through the region's industrial arteries. Engineers dispatched to evaluate the destruction found entire structures reduced to twisted frameworks, their machinery fused by heat so intense it left metal warped like soft clay. Without functioning rail networks, coal could not be transported, furnaces could not be fed, and production schedules that once measured output by the hour now drifted into indefinite silence. The figures that trickled into Berlin were devastating. Projected fuel output had collapsed by more than half, and steel production, already strained, was forecast to fall below the minimum required to equip even the most essential divisions. On military fronts far from the Ruhr, the consequences rippled outward with alarming speed. Armored units preparing for counteroffensives discovered that deliveries of fuel were delayed or cancelled entirely, forcing commanders to ration their remaining stocks with an austerity that bordered on desperation. Tanks that were meant to spearhead operations remained idle, their engines cold, while maintenance crews scavenged parts in an attempt to keep even a skeleton fleet operational. Luftwaffe squadrons, already crippled by shortages, saw their aircraft grounded for lack of kerosene. Pilots who reported for duty were told to stand down, aware that the skies were now the domain of an adversary that faced no comparable constraints. Tactical planners attempted to adapt, proposing defensive strategies that required minimal fuel consumption, but each proposal was undercut by the fundamental reality that modern warfare could not be waged on empty tanks and powerless factories. Within the Ruhr's surviving communities, the human toll of the raid manifested in quiet, haunting ways. Rescue teams worked through the night, their lanterns casting flickering arcs of light across rubble-strewn streets as they searched for survivors buried beneath collapsed buildings. Families gathered around makeshift bulletin boards displaying lists of the missing, their faces illuminated by the glow of fires still burning in the distance. The acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the bitter winter cold to create an atmosphere that felt both suffocating and surreal. Civilians who had once clung to the hope that Germany's fortified industrial centers could withstand Allied pressure now confronted a stark shift in reality. Many described feeling a sense of irreversible change, as though the raid had torn through not just buildings but the psychological armor that had shielded them from acknowledging the war's likely outcome. Diaries recovered after the war reveal entries filled with despair. "The sky has turned against us," one resident wrote, "and we no longer know how to live beneath it." The German leadership, faced with the enormity of the damage, struggled to comprehend the full scope of the disaster. Officials attempted to assemble emergency response plans, but every measure encountered the same insurmountable obstacles. No fuel, no electricity, no transportation, and no time. Efforts to relocate critical production to underground facilities faltered due to labor shortages and the logistical chaos of moving machinery that weighed thousands of tons. Reports arriving in Berlin grew increasingly grim, each one confirming a systemic collapse that no amount of improvisation could reverse. Analysts within the Air Ministry admitted privately that the Ruhr, once the engine of the Reich's war industry, had been dealt a blow from which it might never fully recover. And as the edges of this realization spread through military and civilian ranks alike, the question shifted from how to rebuild to how the nation would endure the long-term consequences that now loomed, guiding the narrative into the deeper and more enduring impacts that shaped the final phase of the war. In the weeks that followed the devastating raid on the Ruhr, the long-term consequences began to crystallize with a stark clarity that left no room for denial. Germany's industrial recovery, once imagined as a matter of rapid repair and renewed effort, now appeared as an impossible vision. Engineers attempting to restore damaged facilities discovered that replacement machinery no longer existed, spare parts could not be transported, and electrical grids remained crippled. Many factories that escaped total destruction were nevertheless rendered useless by the severed railway lines that prevented coal, ore, and prefabricated components from ever reaching their gates. The synthetic fuel shortage deepened into a crisis that choked every remaining arm of the war effort. Tanks remained stationary in hidden forest depots, their engines silent. Aircraft that might have challenged Allied bombers stayed tethered to runways as metal shells. Truck convoys intended to reinforce the front dwindled until supply columns resembled ghost caravans, their numbers too small to matter. The Wehrmacht, once feared for its mobility and coordinated thrusts, now fought a shrinking war defined by retreat, improvisation, and the grim arithmetic of dwindling resources. Socially, the impact reached far beyond physical destruction. The German population, long conditioned to endure hardship through propaganda and appeals to national unity, began to internalize a more ominous truth. The war was unwinnable. The once unthinkable whispers of defeat became common in shelters and marketplaces as civilians witnessed firsthand the disconnect between the optimistic speeches broadcast over radio and the ruined streets stretching before them. Teachers struggled to reassure children who had come to associate the sound of engines with impending catastrophe. Religious leaders found their congregations shrinking as families sought safety rather than solace. Even party loyalists could not ignore the ever-present smoke columns that lingered for days above the valley. Fear no longer surged in sudden waves, it seeped into daily life, settling into the corners of shattered homes and empty workshops. Politically, the leadership found itself navigating an internal fissure that widened with each passing day. Hardliners insisted that Germany could endure if only its people maintained their discipline, but military advisors quietly acknowledged that the nation was approaching a point beyond recovery. Speer warned that industrial production might never return to even half its pre-raid capacity, and Luftwaffe commanders conceded that fuel shortages rendered their operations symbolic at best. Debates within Berlin shifted from talk of counterattacks to discussions about how long the remaining infrastructure could survive under continued bombardment. These were not the deliberations of a regime preparing for victory. They were the conversations of a system bracing for collapse. Intelligence officers studying the pattern of Allied raids noted that the Americans and British were not merely bombing factories, they were dismantling the interconnected framework that allowed Germany to sustain war on any scale. This realization, more than any single explosion, marked a turning point in the nation's psychological landscape. For historians, the aftermath of the Ruhr raid represents a watershed moment in the European air war. The destruction inflicted that day did not immediately end the conflict, nor did it shatter Germany's military presence overnight, but it set in motion an irreversible decline, one rooted in the loss of industrial coherence, strategic flexibility, and public confidence. The raid demonstrated with unmistakable force that air power, when combined with intelligence, coordination, and industrial superiority, could strike at the very foundations of a modern state. And for the people who lived through it, the memory of that day endured long after the fires were extinguished. Survivors spoke of the silence that followed the bombardment, a silence heavier than the noise that preceded it, as though the land itself were pausing to absorb the magnitude of what had occurred. In that silence lay the truth that Germany's future had changed course, and the war's trajectory had tilted decisively toward its final chapters. With this realization came a somber understanding that what remained was no longer a struggle for victory, but a reckoning with the consequences that would define Europe's post-war reality.